In this video, I'll talk about how to use the spreadsheet template to import cost codes, cost budgets, and contract amounts for unit price contracts. We find the import template in the Help Center. Let's go to Getting Started. Import options from Microsoft Excel. Under Contract Administration, click the first link, Set up job cost codes, prime contract, and budgets. And then scroll down to find the unit price contract links. Remember that when we import any spreadsheet into Sage Construction Management, we need to have the values on the first sheet in the workbook, and that sheet must be named Sheet 1 with no space. The system will ignore all other sheets after the first one, and it will only import a sheet with the correct name, which is Sheet 1 with no space. The column names in row 1 can be present in any sequence, but they must be named exactly as you see here. The required fields are indicated with an asterisk in the Help topic. In this example, the template is color-coded to make it easier to discuss the layout, but your spreadsheet doesn't need to use the colors. The first section is purple, and these are the job cost code columns. The cost code and cost code description columns are for the project cost codes that will be used specifically for this project. With unit price prime contracts, you should not have any duplicated cost codes in column B. You might have a standard cost code library that you use for reporting and analysis across all projects. And therefore, you want to keep your cost codes and descriptions consistent across all projects, so your reports are meaningful. When you add project-specific cost codes here, you can modify them as needed to fit the current project. Then, you can add additional columns that tie to your internal division codes list. Those codes and descriptions should match the master list exactly, and that's what will enable that cross-project reporting. You'll recall that cost codes can be sectioned into 4 tiers, and your internal reporting columns can show any of the 4 tiers. In this example, columns D and E have the headings Cost Code Div and Cost Code Div Desk, which refer to the top tier, the division. We could add additional columns for the master cost code major, minor, and sub-minor sections. Remember, the Help topic explains how to name additional columns if you want to include more grouping levels. Just remember that cost codes are tracked and reported at the level of detail you specify in this spreadsheet, so if you only need to see totals by division, you do not need to add these extra columns. Unit price contract budget imports may also need to use a specific job cost code specified by the project owner to align with the project owner's budget. Although owner codes and groupings are allowed, in this case, the best practice is to have your project-specific job cost codes align with the project owner's requirements. After the cost code groupings, you'll see the quantity in units expected for this contract item, and if you don't specify these values, the default value will be 1, with LS for lump sum as the unit. You can change values on the prime contract at any point before creating a prime invoice, so it's helpful to have as much information as you can in the spreadsheet. We'll talk about prime invoices in an upcoming lesson. The next section, the red columns, lets you set up expected costs for this contract. Instead of entering the expected total price for each cost type, you'll enter a unit cost rate. The cost budget should be calculated by multiplying the quantity for that cost code times the unit cost rate, times any conversion factor to account for different units. For example, the first cost code has a quantity of 500 linear feet. The item is purchased at $4 per linear foot, so the material cost budget is $2,000. The labor cost budget would be the number of labor hours times the labor rate. You'll want to set up the calculation columns for each of the cost type budgets. You can include formulas in cells in the Excel spreadsheet. If you do, the result of the formula is imported, not the formula itself. The labor and equipment cost types have additional columns for the labor and equipment burden. You can use those to include employee benefits, equipment ownership costs, and so on, and these each have the calculated budget field as well. It's important to track labor and equipment burden as part of the true cost of each project. The template also includes columns for the total cost, the sum of all cost type budgets for each cost code, and the total unit cost. In the green columns, for the contract unit rate, you'll enter the negotiated unit price for each cost code. The revenue budget is calculated by multiplying that unit price times the cost code quantity. Make sure that your calculated total unit cost is less than the negotiated unit cost for the contract, and that the revenue budget is more than the total cost budget for each cost code. The revenue budget is the amount you'll bill the owner, and it should include your profit, markup, and overhead costs. The LBRHRS budget column lets you indicate the number of person hours you expect to use for this cost code, and you'll only enter labor hours for cost codes that have a labor component in the budget. This should be approximately equal to the expected labor cost for this cost code, divided by the average hourly rate for your workers, including burden. The equipment runtime, downtime, and idle time hours let you track hours for any cost code that has an equipment cost component. The runtime hours will be highest unit cost, because the equipment is actively being used. Idle time and downtime hours should cover the remainder of the time that the equipment is on the job site. Remember that the rate you enter for each cost type needs to reflect the same units as the cost code's overall units, in order for the calculations to be accurate. In this example, the quantities are in linear feet and so is the pricing. The quantities in the cost column should not include your profit overhead, fees, or other markups, as those will be included in the revenue column. In this video, you learned how to set up the spreadsheet template for unit cost prime contracts. Now you're ready to create the prime contract.